Filmmaking is undergoing something of a revolution in this country and worldwide. Despite the savage cutbacks in public funding to film, more and more innovative filmmakers are embracing the guerrilla model, both of film production and of marketing, fundraising and distribution. Now, there are both strengths and weaknesses to this development. The strength is that it enables filmmakers to harness their creativity and make films under difficult circumstances. While innovations in technology make it easier and cheaper to create films, the internet makes it easier to raise funds, build a fan base and disseminate product independently of the conventional structures and channels. And all of this is positive. But filmmaking isn't primarily about technical innovations or building a fan base or marketing products on the web under historical conditions where free is the new black. All of these technical and marketing developments have to be considered in their historical and cultural context, because filmmaking is, by its nature, both a social and cultural process rather than a purely technical one. At the core of the filmmaking process is narrative. And narrative was being undermined and marginalised in British filmmaking long before guerrilla filmmakers came along. Narrative drama accounts for less and less of the overall proportion of television product in a country where historically the film industry is either a parochial outpost of Hollywood or an extension of British television drama in its best aspects. And although the radical content, which at least in some ways was good, of BBC's one-hour plays has gone, the practices of dialogue-driven theatrical naturalism are recreated in television drama, particularly by the BBC Writers' Academy, which trains up new generations of writers by putting them to work on soap operas. This militates against the Aristotelian conventions of classical narrative construction. It means that for all of the technical innovations of the last 20 years, we are no closer today to Troy Kennedy Martin's vision of cinematic television than when he first wrote his manifesto to this effect as long ago as 1964. The problem is amplified by the intervention of postmodernist academic criticism, which disputes the existence of a canon of excellence in art and argues that soap operas or reality TV or other manifestations of toxic television are of cultural value and equally ranked to classically constructed narrative drama. This is ridiculous and can only lead to bad art, which in this case means bad film. Now, in fairness, the guerrilla filmmakers did not invent the marginalisation of narrative. However, they did inherit it. They inherited it from the film schools. They inherited it from the universities and from the prevalent practices of British television at this time. But, that being said, the practice whereby a guerrilla filmmaker, of necessity to court public funding, typically tries to make a feature film on the back of a 20-minute short will inevitably recreate these prevailing practices unless they are directly challenged from day one by a central commitment to Aristotelian principles and classical narrative construction. Guerrilla filmmakers, before ever they bring their innovations of technology and marketing to bear, have to rediscover Alfred Hitchcock's adage that the three most important things about any film are the script, the script, the script. They have to learn that a feature film is not just an expanded version of a short, inflated like a bicycle tyre. Rather, a short must be distilled from a completed 3-act film script in order to promote that project and procure funding from public bodies who are very often hostile to art. Improvisation, as the alleged mother of invention, has its place, but only when subordinated to Aristotelian convention, the 3-act structure, and the 6 points. Now, there's a formula for distilling a self-contained short from a 90 to 120 minute script that follows the conventions laid down by Aristotle, and we will be introducing those to you in this film course at the appropriate time. That being said, Aristotle's conventions as laid down in the Poetics have to come first, and that is the point of departure for this filmmaking course that makes it unique among other filmmaking courses of its kind. Now, When the Lumiere brothers invented the technical process of moving cinematic images on film, one would think that this was probably the origins of the modern film industry. However, I query this. To my way of thinking, cinema would have remained a fairground attraction unless D.W. Griffith or someone else like him hadn't imposed classical narrative structures on filmmaking and then developed genres of film fiction through which these classical themes could be executed. Now, we all know that Griffith wasn't the kind of person we'd invite home at dinner. He was quite reactionary politically. His Birth of the Nation was primarily a defence of the Ku Klux Klan. But that being said, he was a better filmmaker than his contemporaries. He was a better filmmaker than Eisenstein. And Eisenstein knew this, even though he didn't quite know why. As the 20th century has progressed into the 21st century, so indeed, filmmaking has become a vehicle for social and political commentary, much of it quite radical in nature, and that's a good thing. But even these innovations have been rendered possible only on the basis of a dialogue with the conventions of classicism. And indeed, as we'll be demonstrating, the history of 20th century filmmaking was, from this point onwards, to the point of the early 20th century onwards, a dialogue between artistic necessity, represented by classicism and the Aristotelian tradition, and artistic freedom, represented by social realism and elements derived from the avant-garde. The relationship between the two, as we will discover, broadly corresponds to the relationship between artistic necessity and artistic freedom in the three-act structure of a classically constructed drama. And we'll come to that in a minute. In each example, both when we're looking at individual films and when we're looking at the development of film as a body of art, the conventions or plots are established in the first act, which in the classically constructed drama corresponds to roughly the first half hour of a film. This plot then tests and reveals the development of character in the second act, culminating in what we call the protagonist's low point at the end of the second act. In the history of filmmaking, if you imagine that as a three-act structure as well, realist and avant-garde criticisms of classical convention correspond to this second act and are usually initiated in the realm of artistic freedom. They usually do so with technological innovation acting as a cultural conduit, but the classicism has to be there in order for that dialogue to take place. However, classically constructed drama is always paid off and is always achieves its closure in the third act, which constitutes a synthesis of plot and character, but is always paid off back in the domain of artistic necessity. And the same thing applies with historical developments in film. You know, radical ideas may emerge in the area of artistic freedom and so on and so forth, but those ideas will be more fully executed and more adequately executed if you move back into the domain of artistic necessity and classical convention. At the moment, the innovations of guerrilla filmmaking, like those of every other avant-garde movement that preceded it, are still stuck in the second act, in the realm of artistic freedom. And to move mainstream and to endure, they must embrace Aristotelian convention and classical rules of narrative construction, or else perish like all forms of avant-gardism before them. And this is why, when I wrote my book on script writing, and I called it From Mumblecore to Mainstream, and aimed it at today's guerrilla filmmakers, I chose that title with some considerable care.